Did Roman gladiators really fight to the death? Today, let's talk about warriors the gladiators. Popular media, including the 2000 film Gladiator, often dramatize Roman gladiators engaged in vicious battles that invariably end with at least one fighter dead. However, the reality of gladiatorial combat is more nuanced. Not all fights ended in death. While some bouts did result in fatalities, this was not a constant outcome. Alfonso Manes, a researcher at the University of California, Berkeley, who has conducted extensive studies on gladiators, asserts that the mortality rate among these fighters fluctuated significantly over time. For instance, tomb paintings from the 4th century BC at Paestum, a Lucanian city that eventually fell under Roman control, vividly illustrate gladiators suffering severe injuries, including spears lodged in their heads. This evidence strongly indicates that many early gladiatorial contests led to the death of one or both combatants. But the question is how well gladiator games underwent significant reforms after 27 BC, resulting in a decrease in the death rate, as noted by Manes. These reforms took place during the reigns of Emperor Augustus, circa 30 BC to AD 14, and Tiberius, circa AD 14 to 37. According to Manes, in the 1st century AD, we have a clear understanding of the death rate. Studies of gladiator fights depicted on the walls of Pompeii indicate that out of 5 fights, 1 ended in the death of the loser. He further suggested that this death rate likely remained consistent during the 2nd century AD. Although many gladiators were slaves, the decline in mortality led some free individuals to voluntarily become gladiators. While the specific rules that changed after 27 BC are not known, evidence suggests that a gladiator could surrender by dropping their shield and extending their index finger, according to Manes. There was also a summa rudis, or referee, who could enforce the rules and stop the fight if a gladiator was about to be killed. If the person hosting the games allowed it, the defeated gladiator could leave the arena unharmed. However, if the host insisted on the gladiator's execution, they would have to pay a substantial sum to the gladiator's owner. Virginia Campbell, a lecturer in classical studies at the Open University, explained in an email to Live Science that magistrates could rent gladiators from their owners to organize games. Evidence of these contracts shows that if a gladiator returned severely injured or was killed, the lease agreement would convert to a sale, with the price possibly increasing by as much as 50 times the original contract cost. Manes also observed that the death rate among gladiators appears to have increased in the 3rd century AD. A greater taste for cruelty became popular among the people, and fights in which the loser could not ask for pardon became common again, he stated. Historical sources from the 3rd century suggest that 1 out of every 2 fights resulted in the death of the loser. The high death rate among gladiators may have persisted into the 4th century. Mosaics at the site of Torinova depict the defeated gladiators from a series of fights as dead, as noted by Manes. Gladiatorial games began to decline in the 5th century, and the remaining contests were unlikely to result in death, he stated. Not everyone who entered the arena was a trained gladiator. Many were untrained prisoners who had been sentenced to death and were forced to fight wild animals. These prisoners typically had no training, often no weapons or only the most basic ones, and were expected to die, as noted by Campbell. This usually led to their inevitable deaths. The prisoners faced hungry animals, hoping to survive long enough to avoid being torn apart. According to Campbell, these brutal killings often served as a prelude to the actual battles between trained gladiators. Since the prisoners were untrained and armed with little to nothing, they were relatively inexpensive. This practice not only provided cheap entertainment but also acted as a form of social deterrent. It warned people against committing crimes, as they could end up in the arena. Thus, it combined entertainment with social control. Editor's note: this article was updated at 10:48 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time on September 26 to clarify that Paestum was a Lucanian city, not a Greek city as previously stated. The Lucanians were a people from what is now southern Italy. 10 things you may not know about Roman gladiators. 1. They weren't always enslaved. Not all gladiators were brought to the arena in chains. While most early combatants were enslaved individuals or those who had committed crimes, grave inscriptions show that by the 1st century AD, the demographics began to change. Enticed by the thrill of battle and the roar of the crowds, Many free men started voluntarily signing contracts with gladiator schools, hoping to gain glory and prize money. These independent fighters were often desperate men or ex-soldiers skilled in combat. However, some were upper-class patricians, knights, and even senators who were eager to showcase their warrior heritage. 2. Gladiatorial bouts were originally part of funeral ceremonies. Many ancient chroniclers described the Roman games as an import from the Etruscans, but most historians now argue that gladiatorial contests originated as a blood rite at the funerals of wealthy nobles. When distinguished aristocrats died, their families would hold graveside bouts featuring enslaved people or condemned prisoners as a macabre eulogy for the virtues the deceased had demonstrated in life. According to Roman writers Tertullian and Festus, the Romans believed that human blood helped purify the soul of the deceased, suggesting that these contests served as a crude substitute for human sacrifice. The funeral games expanded significantly during the reign of Julius Caesar, who organized bouts featuring hundreds of gladiators to honor his deceased father and daughter. These spectacles proved immensely popular, and by the end of the 1st century BC, government officials began hosting state-funded games to gain favor with the masses. Hollywood movies and television shows often depict gladiatorial bouts as chaotic and bloody free-for-alls, but in reality, most fights operated under fairly strict rules and regulations. Contests typically featured single combat between two men of similar size and experience. Referees oversaw the action and likely stopped the fight as soon as one participant was seriously wounded. A match could even end in a stalemate if the crowd became bored with a prolonged battle. In rare cases, both warriors might be allowed to leave the arena with honor if they had entertained the crowd with an exciting performance. Since gladiators were expensive to house, feed, and train, their promoters were reluctant to see them killed unnecessarily. Trainers likely taught their fighters to wound rather than kill, and the combatants may have taken it upon themselves to avoid seriously injuring their fellow fighters. Nevertheless, the life of a gladiator was often brutal and short. Most gladiators lived only into their mid-20s, and historians estimate that between 1 in 5 and 1 in 10 bouts resulted in the death of one of the participants. If a gladiator was seriously wounded or surrendered by throwing down his weapon, his fate was handed over to the spectators. In contests held at the Colosseum, the emperor had the final say on whether the fallen warrior would live or die. However, rulers and fight organizers often allowed the audience to make the decision. Paintings and films frequently depict the crowd making a thumbs-down gesture to signify that they wanted a disgraced gladiator to be killed, but this portrayal may be inaccurate. Some historians believe that the signal for death might have actually been a thumbs up, while a closed fist with 2 fingers extended, a thumbs down, or even a waved handkerchief could have represented mercy. Regardless of the gesture used, it was typically accompanied by loud cries of either, "Let him go," or "Slay him." If the crowd desired it, the victorious gladiator would deliver a gruesome coup de grace by stabbing his opponent between the shoulder blades or through the neck and into the heart. 5. They were organized into different classes and types. Games had transformed from chaotic battles to the death into a well-organized blood sport. Fighters were categorized into classes based on their records, skill levels, and experience, with most specializing in specific fighting styles and types of weaponry. The most popular gladiators were the Threses and Myrmilones, who fought with swords and shields. There were also the Equites, who entered the arena on horseback, the Esidarii, who fought from chariots, and the Dymacharis, who wielded 2 swords at once. Among the various types of gladiators, perhaps the most unusual was the Retiarius, who was armed only with a net and a trident. These warriors aimed to ensnare their opponents with their net before moving in for the kill. However, if they failed, they were left nearly defenseless. 6. They only rarely fought against animals. The Colosseum and other Roman arenas are notorious for their brutal animal hunts, though gladiators rarely participated. These brutal contests were the domain of the Venators and Bestiarii, specialized fighters who faced off against various creatures such as deer, ostriches, lions, crocodiles, bears, and even elephants. Animal hunts were typically the opening act at the games, with countless animals being killed in a single event. During the Colosseum's 100-day inauguration ceremony, around 9,000 animals were slain. Later, Emperor Trajan's 123-day festival saw the death of another 11,000 animals in the 2nd century AD. Some animals were killed merely for sport, others were trained for tricks or forced to fight each other. Wild animals also served as a common method of execution. Convicted criminals and Christians were often thrown to starving dogs, lions, and bears as part of the day's entertainment. It's fascinating and horrifying in equal measure how ancient spectacles often mingled grandeur with brutality. Historians remain uncertain about when women first donned armor to fight as gladiators, but by the 1st century AD, they had become a common presence at the games. Although these warriors may not have been taken seriously within the patriarchal Roman culture, some managed to prove themselves in single combat. A marble relief dating to around the 2nd century AD depicts a match between two women named Amazon and Achillea. The inscription notes that their fight ended in an honorable draw. Women also participated in animal hunts, but their involvement in the arena likely came to an end around 200 AD when Emperor Septimius Severus banned their participation in the games. Although they frequently had to engage in life-or-death combat, gladiators considered themselves part of a brotherhood. Some even formed unions, known as collegia, complete with elected leaders and designated protector deities. When a warrior fell in battle, these groups would ensure that their comrade received a proper funeral and an inscription on his grave honoring his achievements in the arena. Additionally, if the deceased had a wife and children, the collegia would make sure that the family received financial compensation for their loss. Hosting gladiatorial games was an effective way for Roman emperors to win the affection of the populace. Some emperors took it a step further and actually participated in combat themselves. Notable rulers like Caligula, Titus, and Hadrian competed in the arena, although it was likely under highly controlled conditions and often with dull weapons. The unstable Emperor Commodus was particularly known for his marked skill with a spear. He often attempted to impress the crowd by killing bears and panthers from the safety of a raised platform. Commodus also engaged in gladiator fights, but typically against inexperienced combatants or even terrified, poorly armed members of the audience. When he inevitably emerged victorious, he rewarded himself with a substantial prize of 1 million Roman sesterces. Although often dismissed as uncivilized brutes by Roman historians, gladiators achieved significant fame among the lower classes. Their images adorn the walls of many public spaces. Children played with clay action figures of gladiators, and the most successful fighters even endorsed products, much like today's top athletes. Gladiators were also well known for their ability to impress Roman women. Graffiti from Pompeii describes one fighter who catches the girls at night in his net, and another who is the delight of all the girls. Many women wore hairpins and other jewelry dipped in gladiator blood, while some even mixed gladiator sweat, considered an aphrodisiac at the time, into facial creams and other cosmetics.